The hall smelled like pine smoke and old blood. Lyra felt it the moment she crossed the threshold, a pull so sharp it nearly stopped her feet. She had been told about the bond her whole life, the way it announced itself like a bell struck in the chest, like something sleeping inside you suddenly waking with a gasp. She had not believed it would feel like that. She had thought people were being dramatic, the way people always were dramatic about things they could not explain. She believed it now. She stood in the doorway of the great convergence hall, and she felt the cord of it snapping taut, tugging her forward towards something she could not yet see through the crowd. Thousands of wolves had gathered tonight beneath the iron chandeliers and the carved stone arches. The pack convergence only happened once every 5 years, and every alpha, beta, elder and ranked member of the 7 packs filled the hall shoulder to shoulder. The candles burned high, the smoke hung low. Voices rolled through the space like distant thunder, and the floor vibrated with the energy of so many wolves in one place. Lyra was not supposed to be here. She was not ranked, she carried no title. She had come with the kitchen staff because Cook Marin needed 3 extra hands to serve the warm spiced cider that the elder wolves expected when they arrived from cold travel. Lyra's job tonight was to pour and disappear, that was the whole of it. She had tucked her dark hair back, put on the grey work tunic, and told herself this was simply one more evening of being nobody. The cord pulled harder. She picked up a tray of cups and moved into the crowd, keeping her eyes down the way all Omegas learn to keep their eyes down, not from weakness but from survival instinct, the same way a bird kept still in tall grass. She wove between broad-shouldered warriors and silk-draped elders, and she did not look up. She handed out cups. She smiled when smiled at. She made herself small and useful and forgettable. Then the crowd shifted. A path opened down the center of the hall, not because anyone announced it, not because guards pushed people aside. The crowd simply moved, the way a river split around a stone by instinct, by the pull of something heavy and undeniable passing through. Lyra felt the shift before she saw its cause. The air changed pressure. The noise dropped 2 levels all at once, that particular hush that did not come from politeness but from awe the kind wolves gave to only one thing. Their king. She looked up. She had to, it was not a choice. He walked like he had never once hurried for anyone and never intended to start. Not tall the way decorative men were tall, built to be admired from across a room. Tall the way a cliff face was tall, the way things were tall that had simply grown without stopping because nothing had ever told them to. His hair was dark, swept back, and his eyes were the color of iron left in rain, not gray, not blue, something in between that the light could not quite settle on. He wore no crown tonight. He did not need one. Every wolf in this hall already knew what he was. King Selim Vas, the youngest alpha king in recorded pack history, ruler of the Iron Seat, head of the Prime Pack, the wolf that 3 challenger packs had declared war against in the last decade and 3 challenger packs had stopped existing afterward. He was not a story people told to scare children. He was a story people told to explain to children what power actually meant. Lyra's tray tilted. She caught it barely. A cup slid to the edge and she pressed her thumb against the rim and it stopped, and she breathed and told herself to stop being ridiculous. She looked back down. She focused on the polished stone floor. She counted her steps. The cord pulled so hard she thought it might crack a rib. Her head came up again on its own. Against her will, against every rule she had drilled into herself over 22 years of learning to survive at the bottom of a pack that had never once made room for her. Her eyes found him the way your tongue found a sore tooth, automatically, helplessly, without permission. He had stopped walking. He was looking at her. Not in the way men looked at a woman who had caught their attention. Not with appreciation or curiosity or any of the things that could be survived. He looked at her the way you looked at a problem you had not anticipated. He looked at her the way you looked at something that had gone wrong. The hall had gone fully quiet. Lyra realized slowly, the way you realized a house was on fire when the smoke had already reached the ceiling, that everyone was watching. Not him, her, they were watching her. Every alpha from 7 packs. Every elder with their long memories and longer grudges. Every warrior who had spent a week traveling to stand in this hall and witness the convergence. They were all watching an Omega girl freeze in the middle of the floor with a tray of cider cups. She made herself move. She turned left toward the serving table, keeping her steps measured and her back straight. She could feel the stairs like heat from 100 different directions. She set the tray down with hands that were perfectly steady because she had decided they would be. She picked up an empty pitcher and began refilling it from the barrel because she needed something to do with her hands and her face. Elder Roan's voice came from somewhere behind her, old and carrying. The king appears to have sensed something. A murmur moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Lyra did not turn around. She heard the footsteps. She knew whose they were. She knew without looking, the way she had always known things through her skin before her mind caught up. Slow, deliberate, no urgency in them, the footsteps of someone who was not coming to her but was coming toward something that happened to involve her. There was a difference. She understood it even before he spoke. The hall was so quiet she could hear a candle spitting wax 12 feet away. He stopped behind her. She turned because she had to, because refusing to turn would have been its own kind of declaration, and she was not ready to make declarations. Up close he was worse, not in any way she had words for at that moment, just worse, more real, more present, too large for a person to be without being somehow threatening even while perfectly still. His jaw was set the way gates were set when people wanted no traffic passing through. His eyes moved over her face, and she felt them the way you felt someone check the locks on a door, methodical, conclusive, looking for something and failing to find it. His gaze dropped to the bond point at her collarbone, where the faded cord always gathered its warmth. It was glowing faintly. She had not known that would happen. She had not known it would be visible. Nobody had told her it would be visible. His jaw tightened, just barely, the kind of tightening that only meant something if you were watching for it, and she was watching because she was terrified. Then he turned, not to her, to the hall. He spoke in a voice that did not need to be loud to be heard in every corner. "I refuse the bond." 3 words, 4 words, she lost count. They were flat and clear, the way an axe was flat and clear when it had been swung and completed its task. There was no performance in it, no cruelty for its own sake, just a fact being stated the way a king stated facts, expecting the world to rearrange itself accordingly. The bond point at her collarbone went cold. Not slowly, all at once the way light went out. The hall breathed in as one. Lyra held very still. She kept her eyes on the middle distance. She did not let her hands move to her collarbone. She did not press them to the cold place where a second ago something had lived and now nothing did. She thought about the pitcher in her hands, the weight of it, the cool surface of the metal against her palms. She thought about those things until they were the only things, until they filled the space where the cord had been. Elder Roan spoke again. He was not being cruel. He was being procedural, which was somehow worse. The king is within his rights under pack law. A bond may be refused before the formal claiming. The refusal is now a matter of record. More murmurs, louder now. One of the alphas from the northern pack laughed, not a long laugh, just a breath of it. Enough. Lyra set the pitcher down on the table. She turned to face the hall. She did not know why she did it. Some part of her that had spent 22 years being told to look down chose this exact moment, this worst possible moment, to stop. She looked at the hall. She looked at the alphas and the elders and the warriors. She looked at all of them looking back at her. She did not smile and she did not crumble and she did not say a single word. Then she turned and walked toward the side door, the one the kitchen staff used, the one that led out past the woodpile and into the cold night air. She walked at a pace that could not be called fleeing. Nobody stopped her. Nobody spoke to her. The crowd parted just enough, not from respect but from the awkwardness of proximity to someone humiliated, the way people stepped around something they did not want to touch. The side door closed behind her. The cold hit her face and she stood in it for one moment, just one, her hand pressed flat against the stone wall, her eyes up at the black sky with its handful of pale stars. The place at her collarbone where the bond had been was an absence she felt physically, an ache that was not quite pain and not quite numbness. It was something she did not have a word for yet. She breathed. Then she walked. She walked past the woodpile and past the guard post where the night sentry was looking in the other direction, and past the fence post with the broken iron finial that she had used as a landmark since she was 9 years old. She walked to the small stone building at the edge of the compound that she had called home for the last 3 years, a single room with a narrow window and a door that locked from the inside with a bolt she had installed herself. She went inside. She locked the bolt. She did not light a candle. She stood in the dark and she breathed and she let the silence be what it was. The cold was in the walls and in the floor and in her chest where the bond had briefly, impossibly been. She pressed the heel of her hand against that place on her collarbone for a long time, not because it helped, but because her body needed to do something, and that was the only thing available. Outside, faintly, she could hear the hall. The noise had resumed. The convergence would continue. Kings did not stop ceremonies for refusals. Refusals, apparently, were not even interesting enough to pause the cider service for long. She let out one long breath. In the morning, she would need to decide what to do with the fact that her fated mate was the Alpha King. She already knew she was not going to do the obvious thing. She was not going to petition the elders. She was not going to request an audience. She was not going to stand outside his hall and make herself a problem for him to solve. She had survived 22 years at the bottom of a pack by understanding one thing clearly: nobody was going to hand her anything. If she stood still and waited, the world would arrange itself around her absence and nothing would change. She was not going to stand still. She reached under her narrow bed and pulled out the canvas bag she kept there. She had packed it once before, 2 years ago, when a different threat had made leaving seem necessary. She had not needed it that time. She had found another way. She reached inside and checked its contents by feel in the dark. The way she had checked it 100 times since she first put it together. The same habit you got when the only safety net you had was the one you built yourself. A few things were missing. Things she had used and not replaced. She would need to replace them. She pushed the bag back under the bed. She lay down on top of the blanket without taking her boots off, her eyes open to the dark ceiling, her hand still against the cold place at her collarbone. She did not sleep. She did not cry either, not because she was past it, not because the rejection had not reached inside and taken something it had no right to take, but because she had one rule she had kept her whole life, one line she had never let herself cross. She did not cry over things other people did to her. She cried over things she had done herself, over her own mistakes, her own failures, her own moments of being less than she wanted to be. What had happened tonight was not her mistake. What had happened tonight belonged entirely to a king who had looked at his fated mate and decided she was not enough without knowing her name or the color of her thoughts or what she did when the world went dark. That was not hers to cry over. She pressed her hand harder against her collarbone. Outside, the hall blazed on. The torches and the cider and the politics of 7 packs moving around each other like heavy wheels in close quarters. Inside, in the dark, an Omega girl who had just been publicly refused by her fated king lay on her bed with her boots on and her jaw set, and counted the things she needed before she could move. She was already adding to the list. She was already making a plan. She lay there in the cold dark of her small stone room, eyes open, hand against her chest, and the thought that moved through her mind was not about him. It was not about the hall or the shame or the way that Alpha from the northern pack had laughed with just one breath. The thought was simple and clear, and it steadied her the way the old knife her mother had left her steadied her when she held it, clean and certain and already done. By dawn she would be gone. She had been thinking about leaving for years. She had always thought she was waiting for the right moment, the right reason, the right level of desperation. She understood now, lying in the dark while the bondache sat cold in her chest, that she had been waiting for permission. And permission was never going to come from the kind of world that put a girl like her at the bottom of the stack and expected her to stay grateful for the floor space. She sat up. She reached under the bed. She pulled out the bag. She turned it out onto the blanket and started over. She had never been more awake in her life. Her hands moved quickly and without hesitation, sorting and organizing and deciding, and there was something almost like relief in it, the feeling of finally doing the thing you had been building toward for longer than you had admitted to yourself. The cold in her collarbone did not go away. She did not expect it to go away quickly. Bond wounds did not work like that. But her hands were steady. That was the thing about her. That had always been the thing about her. The thing that nobody in this pack had ever thought to notice because they had been too busy categorizing her by rank and deciding what she was worth based on a system that had been designed by people who had never once needed to survive anything hard. She did not fall apart. She was not built for falling apart. She was built for exactly this, the moment after everything went wrong, the moment when most people sat down and most people cried and most people waited for someone to come and help them. Lyra had learned early that no one was coming. So she packed. Her hands moved in the dark without needing light because she knew every item in that bag and every item's purpose. She moved quietly, efficiently, with the particular economy of someone who had been planning this even when she told herself she wasn't. Outside, the distant sounds of the convergence wound on. Inside, in one small stone room with one locked bolt and one narrow window, an Omega sorted the tools of her leaving and did not once look back. By morning, the room would be empty. By morning, she would already be past the boundary stones and into the forest, where her scent would scatter on the northern wind, and the pack bond would still be connected enough that no one would notice its changed frequency until she was too far to follow easily. By morning, King Selim Vas would be eating his breakfast in his great hall, and she would be no one's problem, and no one's story, and no one's anything. She thought that was the plan in those midnight hours while she sorted her bag. She did not yet know what she was carrying. She would not know for 3 more days, when the morning sickness hit her in a forest camp, and she sat very still beside her small fire and did the arithmetic that she had been avoiding doing for 3 weeks, and the numbers came out the same every way she tried them, and the thing she had been refusing to name named itself. But that was 3 days away. Tonight she packed. Tonight she was just a girl who had been refused before 1,000 wolves, and had walked out of that hall on her own 2 feet without crying or begging or making herself into something pitiable. Tonight she was just a girl with a canvas bag and a plan in hands that did not shake. That was enough. That had always been enough. She pulled the strap over her shoulder and stood up straight and looked at the dark room one last time. The narrow bed, the small window. 3 years she had lived here. 3 years of making this cold little room into something close to safe, something close to hers. She looked at it the way you looked at a thing you were choosing to leave, not with grief, not with anger, with the particular clear seeing that came when you had already decided and the deciding was done. She unlocked the bolt. She opened the door. The night air hit her face, sharp and clean with pine and coming frost, and she stepped out into it and did not look back, and the door swung shut on its own behind her with a sound like a quiet, finished thing. The stars were still out. There were more of them now, the clouds having moved while she was inside. She looked up at them for half a second, not for comfort, not for direction, just the old habit of checking the sky before moving, and then she looked at the tree line and she walked toward it. No one saw her go. The guard at the post was watching the road that led toward the hall, where the convergence lights were still burning. He was watching for trouble from outside. He was not watching for an Omega girl with a canvas bag walking toward the trees. Nobody ever watched for that. That was the last gift the pack had ever given her without knowing it. They had never once thought she was dangerous enough to watch. She reached the tree line. She stepped into the dark between the pines. She disappeared. The morning after the convergence had the particular quality of a room after a storm had passed through it. Everything was still technically in place, but there was a faint wrongness in the air, a sense that the furniture was very slightly shifted from where it had been, and that if you measured the distance between things you would find the measurements did not quite match what you remembered. Selim noticed none of this. He was not a man given to noticing atmosphere. He stood at the tall window of his private study and looked at the pale gray morning spreading over the pack lands. His tea was on the desk behind him, untouched and going cold, the way his tea always went cold in this room because this room was where he thought, and thinking, for him, was not compatible with remembering to drink things. The refusal had been the right decision. He had made it in 2 seconds flat, the moment his eyes had found hers, and the bond had announced itself with that ridiculous chest bell sensation that every wolf described and that he had privately always suspected was an exaggeration. He now knew it was not an exaggeration. He also knew it did not matter. He was the Alpha King. He had 7 packs to manage, 3 ongoing territorial disputes with human governments who were slowly deciding that the old treaties were inconvenient, 2 elder councils who could not agree on inheritance law, and a war debt from the last challenger pack that had not yet been settled in anything but blood. He had 43 pending diplomatic correspondences. He had a summit to chair in 12 days. He did not have time for a fated bond. He especially did not have time for a fated bond with an Omega who worked kitchen service, and whose name he did not know and whose rank in this pack he had checked. He had checked within the hour, which was a thing he was not fully comfortable with having done, was listed as unranked domestic service, which was the polite way the pack record said the very bottom. He had made the right decision. He turned from the window and looked at the tea and did not drink it. His beta Owen knocked and entered the way Owen always entered, precisely 2 seconds after knocking, without waiting for permission, because Owen had been his beta for 8 years and had learned exactly how long to wait and exactly how little pretense Selim required. Owen was not large by alpha standards. He was precise, though, precise in the way well-made tools were precise, built to fit the work they were made for. He had sharp, pale eyes and the habit of standing very still when he was about to say something he thought would cause difficulty. He was standing very still now. Selim looked at him. "Say it." "The Omega from last night," Owen said, not a question. "What about her?" "She's gone." A pause, short, just long enough to register. "What do you mean, gone?" "Her room is empty. The bolt was left unlocked. She packed and left during the night while the convergence was still running." Owen's voice was entirely neutral. It was the voice he used when he had opinions he was choosing not to voice yet. "The gate log shows no departure record, which means she went through the trees." "She knew the guard rotations." Selim said nothing for a moment. "She planned it," he said. "She planned it, yes, or had been planning it for some time, and last night was simply the occasion." Another beat. "She took nothing that wasn't hers. She left the room very clean." Selim turned back to the window. The pale morning looked exactly the same as it had 30 seconds ago. The trees stood where trees stood. The guard post was manned by a sentry who had apparently watched the road all night and not the tree line. Something moved in him that he did not care to identify. It was not guilt. He had made the correct decision and it remained correct. It was not worry. She was an Omega who had presumably left of her own free choice, which was her right under pack law. She was not his responsibility. She was not his mate. He had said so clearly in front of witnesses in language that was legally and ritually binding. The thing that moved in him was closer to surprise. He had expected, he realized now, for her to do something else, to petition, to appear at his hall door, to request a hearing with the elders, to make herself a complication for him to manage. That was what people did when the world delivered them an injustice. They made themselves loud. She had made herself invisible instead. She had packed a bag and walked into the forest. "What was her name?" he said. Owen did not move, but something in his stillness changed quality. "Lyra, no family name on record. She came to this pack 3 years ago from the eastern border territories. No pack origin documented." A pause. "She was 22. Was present tense, but Owen had used past tense without noticing or without caring, already categorizing her as a thing that had been. "What was she rated?" "Unranked, kitchen and domestic." "And her strength assessment?" Owen was quiet for a moment. "There is no strength assessment on record. She was never assessed." Selim turned from the window and looked at his beta. Owen met the look evenly. Omegas at that rank are not routinely assessed unless a ranked wolf requests it. No ranked wolf ever requested it. So she had come to this pack and worked its kitchens for 3 years, and nobody had thought to check what she was beyond the category of useful and forgettable. That was standard. That was how it worked. He could not pretend otherwise. "The bond point," he said, not explaining what he meant. Owen would understand. Owen understood, still active. Selim looked at his collarbone. Through the shirt he could feel it faint, very faint, a distant warmth that should not have still been there this long after the refusal. A bond that had been ritually refused should have cooled within an hour. It was how it worked. He had refused bonds before twice in political negotiations, carefully and without ceremony, bonds that had faded exactly as they should. This one had not faded. It was not loud. It was not pulling him anywhere. It was simply still there, like a candle behind a thick curtain, present without being visible, warm without being warm enough to do anything about. He did not tell Owen that. "Have the morning report delivered at the usual time," he said. "The summit preparations take priority today. The Third Elder Council's response to the Inheritance Amendment needs a reply before tomorrow." Owen did not move for a moment. "Sir," he said. "Go ahead." Protocol for a departed Omega with no pack designation is a welfare check within 72 hours. She has no pack to receive her, if she's in the forest alone without. She knew the guard rotations. Selim moved to the desk and picked up a stack of correspondence. She planned this. She is not wandering, she is going somewhere she has already decided on. And if she isn't, then the forest will correct that, he said, and heard himself say it and put the correspondence back down. He stood there for a moment with his hands flat on the desk. The bond point was warm. 72 hours, he said. If no contact or sighting, we send a quiet welfare check, not a retrieval, not an announcement, a check. Understood. And Owen, he did not look up from the desk. Nobody discusses last night, it was a refusal, refusals happen, it is not a story. Owen's pause was exactly 1 second longer than necessary. Of course, sir. He left. Selim stood at his desk in the early grey light and looked at his 43 correspondences and thought about none of them for almost 4 full minutes, which was longer than he had not thought about work in recent memory. The bond point was warm. He pressed the flat of his hand against it through his shirt. The warmth was steady and quiet and completely indifferent to the fact that he had refused it in front of 1,000 witnesses. It simply was, like bedrock under soil, like water in a deep well, like something that had decided to exist and had no interest in being argued out of it. He dropped his hand. He pulled the first correspondence off the stack. He began to read. Across the packed lands, in a forest that nobody was watching, a girl with a canvas bag was moving through the trees at a pace that covered ground without making sound, her boots finding the quiet places between roots and stones the way they had learned to find them years ago in a different forest, a different fleeing, a different reason for moving fast and leaving nothing for anyone to follow. She did not think about the man in the hall. She thought about the path ahead. She thought about distance and direction, and the particular shade of gray the sky went before snow came, and whether she needed to change her route to stay below the ridge line where the wind was punishing this time of year. She walked. She disappeared further with every step. She carried, without knowing it yet, the one thing that would eventually make disappearing impossible. But she did not know that yet. And neither did he. And for the next 3 days, they would both be living inside the story they thought they were in, which was the story of a refusal and a leaving. They did not yet know it was a different story entirely. It was a story about an heir. It was a story about what it cost a king to be wrong. And it had, in the quiet gray morning, while one of them read diplomatic letters and the other walked through cold trees, barely begun. 3 weeks before the convergence. 3 weeks before a hall full of wolves and a voice saying the words that should have ended everything, there was a forest path at dusk and a woman walking it alone. Lyra had been sent to gather medicinal bark from the ridge line, Cook Marin's request, one of the small additional tasks that fell to her because Marin trusted her to do things correctly and to come back on time and to not get distracted. She did not mind. The ridgeline path was an hour each way, and the forest was the one place in the packed lands where she felt something close to uncrowded. The trees did not rank her. The pines did not know or care that she was unranked domestic. She had her canvas gathering bag over one shoulder and the old knife in her belt looped the way she always wore it on ridge paths after the autumn, when the bears were restless before their sleep. She was moving quickly, bark collected, heading back before the light went all the way. She heard him before she saw him. A sharp sound from the ridge above, not animal, not natural, the particular sound of something heavy landing wrong. She stopped, she listened. The forest went on being the forest, wind in the upper branches, a creek running somewhere below. Then a voice, low and rough with pain. I would deeply appreciate it if the ground stopped moving. She should have kept walking. She went up the ridge. He was half propped against an old fir tree, one hand pressed to his side, his other arm at a wrong angle that made her chest tighten before she could stop it. He was tall in the way that became apparent even sitting down, long legs stretched out on the pine needles, and he looked like the kind of man who was very rarely in the position of needing assistance, which made his current position both more concerning and faintly ironic. His eyes found her. They were a dark, odd color somewhere between gray and blue depending on the light, and they were steady, which told her either he was not badly hurt or he was the kind of person who kept their eyes steady no matter what their body was doing. How bad, she said. The arm is dislocated, a pause. The ribs are bruised but not broken, I think. The hill had opinions about my descent. She came closer, crouching to his level, professional in the way she had learned from the pack healer years ago before the pack healer had moved on. She looked at the arm. He was right, it was dislocated, the shoulder sitting wrong, the angle of his forearm speaking for itself. She had seen this before. She had helped with this before. "I can reset it," she said. "It will hurt." "I assumed." "Your name?" He looked at her, something moved in his expression, a brief consideration, as if he was deciding something. "Kale," he said, "just that. No family name, no title." She did not press. People in forest in the evening sometimes had reasons not to give full names. She had reasons herself, often enough. "Lyra," she said, and shifted her gathering bag off her shoulder. "Give me your wrist." She reset the shoulder with 2 clean movements, fast and sure, bracing against him without asking permission because hesitation made it worse. He made one sharp sound and then pressed his lips together and breathed through the resettling, and when she sat back, he flexed the fingers of the restored arm carefully, testing. "You've done that before," he said. "I've done many things." She opened her gathering bag and began pulling out a length of linen she kept for wrapping purposes, the everyday kind of being prepared that people developed when they worked in remote places. "The arm needs support for a day at minimum. Hold still." He held still. She wrapped the arm and bound it against his chest in a stabilizing configuration, and he watched her work with those steady gray-blue eyes and said nothing else for a while. The forest went on around them. The light dropped further. She tied off the wrapping and sat back on her heels. "The ribs need rest," she said. "Not wrapping, just rest." "I'll keep that in mind." "How did you end up on the ridge?" "I was climbing down from the upper lookout and the path apparently had different plans." A pause. "I was moving quickly, I should not have been." She looked at him. He did not look like someone who made a habit of moving carelessly. He looked like someone who had been distracted, which could mean many things. "Can you walk?" she asked. He considered. He shifted his weight experimentally. "Yes." "Then I'll take you to the creek crossing. There's a shelter post there that the border wardens use. You can rest there tonight and have someone come for you in the morning." He looked at her for a moment. "You don't have to do that." "No," she agreed, "I don't." She stood up and waited. He stood too, less steadily than he would have liked. She could tell by the brief set of his jaw. She matched his pace without commenting on it, which was its own kind of courtesy. They walked together through the darkening forest, the creek sound growing. He moved well, even hurt. She noticed, careful with his footing, good instincts about where the ground was unstable. He asked her once if she knew the ridge line well, and she said yes, she gathered from it regularly. He did not ask what she gathered. She did not ask again what he'd been doing on the upper lookout. Some conversations worked better with the questions left out. At the creek crossing she showed him the warden's shelter, a low stone structure with a wood-burning stove and a cot and a week's worth of emergency provisions. She showed him how the latch worked. She gave him the rest of her linen in case the wrapping needed changing. She had enough medicinal bark. She did not need anything else from this ridge tonight. She turned to go. "Lyra," he said. She looked back. He was standing in the shelter doorway, his properly functioning arm braced against the frame, his bound arm careful at his chest, and he looked at her with those steady eyes in a way that made her very aware that she had spent an hour in a darkening forest with a man she did not know and had not thought twice about it. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Don't climb down from the ridge in bad light," she said. "The path goes to the left of the big split pine, not the right. Everyone takes the right and then they fall." "I took the right," he said. "I know," she said. And she left. She walked back through the forest in the full dark, navigating by memory and the sound of the creek behind her, and the stars visible in patches between the pines. She thought about the arm, the clean way it had resettled, good anatomy, strong bone structure, the kind that healed well. She thought about the way he had held still when she worked, the deliberate quality of his stillness, the sense of someone choosing not to react rather than being unable to. She thought about the even, considering way he had looked at her, not the way people usually looked at her, through her, past her, at the category she occupied, but directly at her, as if she was the thing that required attention. She thought about these things the way you thought about interesting stones you picked up on a path, noting them, appreciating the weight, putting them in your pocket and walking on. She did not see him again before the convergence. She did not expect to. The forest was large and she was small in it, and people who came from lookouts in the upper ridge came from somewhere with more resources than a kitchen girl, and their paths did not usually cross hers more than once. She remembered his voice when he said thank you, low and careful, like he did not use the words carelessly. She remembered his eyes when she looked back. She put these things in her pocket and kept walking. 3 weeks later, in a hall blazing with torchlight, she would look up from a tray of cider cups and the world would pull itself sideways, and she would find those same grey-blue eyes already looking at her from across a crowded floor. And in those 3 weeks between the forest and the hall, without knowing it, without having any way to know it, the mathematics of one evening on a ridge path had already finished their calculation. She carried it with her into the convergence. She carried it with her out of the convergence hall, through the side door, into the cold night. She carried it now 3 days into the forest, her small fire burning low, her stomach suddenly and completely and undeniably making its own argument. She sat very still beside the fire. The trees stood around her, indifferent and enormous. The stars were sharp above the canopy. A branch settled somewhere with a dry crack. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach. She stayed like that for a long time. Then she leaned forward and added a piece of wood to the fire and watched the sparks lift and scatter and go dark. And she began to think, clearly, practically, with all the tools she had developed over 22 years of thinking clearly about things that could break her if she let them, about what came next. Everything she had planned needed to change. Everything she had calculated had to be recalculated. She was not just running anymore. She was protecting something. She was building something. She was doing the hardest thing a person could do, the thing that required the most from her and offered the least guarantee. She was choosing to go forward when forward was dark and unmapped and entirely uncertain. She thought about the man on the ridge. The man who said his name was Cale. She thought about the hall 3 weeks later, and the voice that had said I refuse the bond before 1,000 witnesses without a single crack in it. She thought about how she had pressed her hand against her collarbone and walked out of that hall on her own feet. She thought about her mother's knife in her bag. She thought about the linen she had given away on a ridge in the dark, freely and without accounting for it, and how she had not expected anything back and had got nothing back and had been fine. She had always been fine. She was going to be fine. The fire caught properly on the new wood, and the warmth expanded into the small circle of her camp, and she sat inside it and made her plans and did not wait for anyone to help her, and did not ask the stars for permission, and did not cry. She had one rule. She kept it. Tomorrow she would move north. She would find the settlement she had heard about in the Eastern Territories, the one that sat outside Pack jurisdiction, outside King's authority, outside all the systems that had spent 22 years deciding what she was worth. She had a skill with healing. She could work. She could pay her way and then some. She would find that place. She would build something there that no one could refuse before 1,000 witnesses. She would do it alone, and she would do it right, and she would not look back. The fire burned. The forest breathed. Somewhere miles away, a king was eating breakfast and handling correspondence, and pressing his palm against a bond point that had not gone cold when it was supposed to. Lyra did not think about that. She thought about the path north. She thought about her child. She put more wood on the fire and let the warmth do its work and stayed awake until the sky began to pale, because she had learned long ago that the best plans were made in the quiet hours before dawn, when there was nothing left in the world but what was real and what was possible. The dark thinned. The birds started. She packed her camp. She stood up, shouldered her bag, and walked north into the first gray light of morning, and the forest took her in, and the forest kept her, and from the outside there was no sign she had ever been there at all except the cold ring of ash where a small fire had burned through the night. Night in a stone room. Lyra sat on the floor, back against the bed, canvas bag open between her legs. The bolt was shot. The single candle she'd allowed herself burned low on the windowsill. She had done this before, this exact motion, bag open, contents out, sorting by what stayed and what went. The first time she was 16, and the situation had been different, but the fear had the same shape, wide and flat and pressing, the kind that didn't announce itself as panic but settled in the body like water settling in a low place, finding every corner. She was not 16 now. She worked fast and without sentimentality. The knife went back in first. Always the knife first, her mother's rule, her mother who had carried that knife through 4 different hard situations before she passed it on and said, "You'll need this more than I do." It was not a weapon. It was a tool. There was a difference, and her mother had understood it, and Lyra had kept understanding it ever since. After the knife, the linen. She had less than she liked. She had given some of it away on a ridge 3 weeks ago without accounting for it. She rolled what remained tight and fit it in the inner pocket. Medical work was her best skill, and her best skill needed supplies, or it was just knowledge with nowhere to land. After the linen, the dried food. Hard flatbread, dried fruit, nuts, the dense kind that lasted. 3 days' worth if she was conservative, and she knew how to be conservative. She had been conservative her whole life, carefully rationing everything, food, words, trust, the parts of herself that could be taken from her. After the dried food, flint and a small tin of oil-soaked tinder, she was going into the forest in late autumn. Fire was not optional. After that, a folded piece of paper with a route written on it in her own cramped handwriting. She had written it 6 months ago during a night when she couldn't sleep. The way you planned things you told yourself were hypothetical while knowing they were not. 3 routes north, annotated with water sources and shelter points, and the places to avoid because the border between pack land and unaffiliated territory was not clean. It was a ragged thing with teeth. She refolded the paper carefully. She heard the distant sounds from the hall still. The convergence was a full-night event. It would not wind down until close to dawn. Good. Sound covered movement. Activity covered absence. By the time anyone counted heads in the morning, she needed to be across the first ridge. She tied the bag closed. She sat with it between her hands and looked at the candle. This was the moment she always reached eventually in all the times she had planned and repacked and prepared. The moment when the practical work was done and the only thing left was the decision. Not the plan, she had the plan, the decision. The one that happened in the body before the mind caught up to it, the one that said yes or no to the whole of it, the one that could not be argued with or rationalized or explained. She thought about morning. She thought about the convergence ending and people dispersing and the gray pack day beginning as it always began, predictable as machinery, and her walking to the kitchen, and starting the breakfast fires and cook Marin saying, "Pass me the salt," without looking up, the way she had said it for 3 years. She thought about doing that tomorrow. She thought about doing it in a week. She thought about doing it for the rest of her life. The cold place at her collarbone made itself felt. It was not sharp tonight. It was the kind of ache that was almost companionable, almost familiar, the way an old injury ached in cold weather, not harming, just present, just reminding. She pressed her thumb against it. She had expected the bond to feel like something wanted. She had expected it to come with warmth, with welcome, with the sense that the universe had done something correct. Everything she had ever been told about fated bonds described them as gifts, as completions. The wolves who found their fated mates described the moment as arriving somewhere they hadn't known they were going. What she had felt tonight was not arrival. What she had felt was recognition. Not of the man, not of the king she had never seen up close before tonight, but of the situation. The pull and the coldness that followed, the thing offered and immediately withdrawn, the particular humiliation of having something announced publicly that was then publicly cancelled, like a decree, and its repeal in the same breath. She had felt that before. Not with bonds, with other things, with promises, with the particular flavor of care that adults offered children at the bottom of systems, and then retrieved when the child was inconvenient. She knew what it felt like, she knew where it led. It led here, it led to a packed bag and a locked bolt and a careful plan. She blew out the candle. She stood up. She had one thing left to do before she left, not practical, not necessary in any way that could be defended to a reasonable person. But she had always done this. Every time she left a place, some version of it said goodbye to the version of herself that had lived there. It was strange, and she knew it was strange, and she did it anyway because the strangeness of it was somehow what made her feel like a person instead of just a function. She put her hand on the cold stone wall. She said nothing aloud. She just stood there for a moment in the dark with her hand against the wall that had kept wind off her for 3 years, and she felt the texture of it, rough and real and indifferent in the way only old stone could be, and she thought, "I was here. For 3 years I was here, and I held myself together, and I survived this place, and the surviving was mine." Then she lifted her hand. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door and drew the bolt and opened it. The night outside was dark and cold and pine-smelling and large, and she stepped into it without hesitation and left the door to swing shut behind her. She moved with care along the edge of the building, staying in the shadow thrown by the wall, angling toward the back fence. She knew the compound layout the way you knew any place you'd lived for 3 years, not by consulting a map but by body memory, by the feet knowing before the head. She knew the guard post ahead had 2 men tonight, Perrin and Cole, both assigned to face the main road, both specifically told to watch for arrivals, not departures, because the threat for convergence night always came from outside. She had heard this discussed. She had been in the room pouring tea and nobody had noticed. People said a great deal in front of the kitchen staff. She waited at the corner until she heard Perrin say something that made Cole laugh, and their attention swung briefly sideways together. The small conspiracy of shared humor, and she moved. Smooth, low, fast, behind the woodpile into the grass margin, to the back fence where the post had rotted at the base, and she had noticed it months ago and said nothing to no one. She lifted the loose section. She went through. She let it settle behind her. She was outside the fence. For a moment she just stood in the dark outside the compound's boundary, breathing the different air. It smelled the same as the air inside. She was not sure why she had expected it to be different. Perhaps because everything inside had always felt like it was pressing against her slightly, some atmospheric weight she had ceased to notice, until right now when it was absent. It was absent. She breathed. She moved. The pack bond was still active while she was this close, a faint background hum at the edge of consciousness, the collective sense of belonging to a connected group. She had never felt it particularly strongly. Omegas at her rank often didn't, the bond being more vivid the higher you sat in the hierarchy. But she felt it now because she was about to lose it, the way you noticed a sound when it stopped. She walked toward the tree line. She did not hurry. Hurrying left tracks, hurrying broke branches. Hurrying was what you did when you were scared, and she was not, she was focused, which was different, the blood going somewhere useful instead of burning itself up in her hands and her throat. The trees came closer. She heard, distantly, a burst of laughter from the direction of the hall, the convergence merriment in full operation. The Alpha King probably seated at the high table, handling politics, moving pieces, performing the particular performance of power that large gatherings required. She wondered briefly if he had thought about her again. She put the wondering away. She stepped into the tree line. The pack bond frayed immediately, the way a conversation frays when you walk out of earshot, not gone, but thinning, losing clarity, becoming more noise than signal. She kept moving and it kept thinning. By the time she had covered 200 meters into the trees, it was a whisper. By 500 meters, it was a pressure she couldn't quite feel anymore. At some point between 500 meters and the first ridge, she couldn't have said exactly when, it stopped. She felt the moment. She had been told she wouldn't feel it, that a low-rank bond dissolution was barely perceptible, that it was nothing like the dramatic severance described in old wolf stories. She felt it. It was not dramatic, it was not loud. It was exactly like what she had described to herself lying in the dark, a silence where noise had been, not painful, not relief, just the fact of absence, a subtraction you registered not by what it took but by the space it left. She stopped walking for a moment. She stood on a root-threaded path between old trees and felt the new silence and breathed it and named it, free. She was outside pack territory. She was free. Then she walked. She walked the rest of the night, covering the first ridge and down into the valley below before the sky started to lighten, moving at a pace designed to eat distance quietly, navigating by the northern star visible in gaps above. She had always been good in the dark. She had spent a great deal of her life in it. By the time gray crept into the east, she was across the valley and into the foothills on the other side, in territory that belonged to no pack and no king. And she found the flat rock beside the stream that her map had described as Waypoint 1. And she sat on it and drank from her water skin and ate a piece of hard flatbread and looked at the pale sky coming up behind the eastern mountains. She was cold. Her boots were wet from crossing the stream. Her legs ached from the night's walking and her back ached from the bag, and the place at her collarbone was still its particular cold ache, that she had decided to simply carry because she had no other option, and carrying things was something she knew how to do. She was not afraid. She was tired and cold, and she was outside Pack land for the first time in 3 years, and she was more free than she had been in longer than that, and she was not afraid. She looked at the lightening sky. The sun came. A red-orange line first, then wider, then the whole of the east opening up like a curtain pulled back, pale gold light flooding the frostwhite hills and turning everything it touched into something almost worth looking at. She watched it. She ate another piece of flatbread. She thought about the road ahead, 2 more days to the northern settlement if she kept pace. She thought about the skills she carried, the healing knowledge, the organizational efficiency that Cook Marin had relied on and never once promoted. The fluency with cold, with dark, with difficulty, that was the particular expertise of people who had been handed hard things early and survived them. She had more to offer than anyone who had known her as unranked domestic had ever noticed. That was fine. The right people would notice, she would make sure of it. She stood up and shouldered her bag. She checked the map. Waypoint 1 to waypoint 2 was a creek-following path, straightforward, mostly flat, sheltered by the ridge above it. She would make good time. She looked back once, just once, in the direction of the Pack lands. She could not see them. The hills were between her and them, and the distance was already real. She turned her back to it. She walked north. She carried what she carried, the knife, the linen, the flatbread, the plan, the knowledge. She was 3 weeks pregnant by a man who had refused her before 1,000 wolves. She walked. The sun climbed. The frost melted off the grass. She was gone. The morning report at the Iron Seat was delivered at 7 sharp, always 7. Selim had established this in his 3rd month as king when the previous system of reports as they arrive had produced the following problem. He had received 11 separate pieces of information before breakfast, and none of them connected to each other, and 2 of them contradicted each other, and he had spent an hour doing organizational work that his staff should have done. He had restructured. He had established 7 o'clock. The report came in a leather folio. Owen compiled it personally, sorted by priority. Selim read it with his tea. Today his tea went cold again. Item 14 near the bottom of the folio was not flagged as a priority. It had been filed under Domestic Administrative, the category for Pack household matters, which was the lowest flag category in the system. It read, confirmation, unranked domestic worker name Lyra, room assignment sector C7 has vacated premises. Room clear, departure appears voluntary, no breach of Pack property noted. He read it twice. He set the folio down. He picked up his tea, remembered it was cold, set it back down. Owen appeared in the doorway of the study, without apparent movement between not being there and being there, which was a talent Selim had ceased to be startled by. Sir. Item 14. Yes, sir. When was it confirmed? First light count, around 6:40. Selim was quiet for a moment. The study was cold this morning, the fire not having fully caught yet. Light came through the tall window at a flat, pale angle, the kind of light that gave everything sharp edges. The bond assessment, he said. Owen's pause was measured, careful, the pause of someone who had been thinking about whether to say the next thing and had decided to say it. Still registering, sir. I asked the court healer for a sensitivity reading this morning at first light. She was hesitant too. What did she say? She said the fated bond does not appear to have completed its dissolution. Another measured pause. She said, in her professional opinion, this was irregular for a ritual refusal. Selim said nothing. The fire cracked, a log settled. She said there was one documented case in the Pack records from 40 years ago. Owen spoke carefully, the way you spoke around something sharp. A king who refused a bond. The bond did not dissolve for 11 months. The healer's notes from that period record that the bond was receiving active return signal from the other party, meaning the fated mate's bond point was sustaining the connection from her side. A long silence. I see, Selim said. In that historical case, Owen continued, the king eventually located his fated mate and formally completed the bond. The records are somewhat. I'm familiar with the case. He was. It was in the historical archive he had memorized at 17 because he had believed at 17 that knowing history was the best protection against repeating it. He had not at 17 thought he would need that particular piece of it. He stood from his desk and walked to the window. The packed land spread below, gray and frostwhite in the early light. The kitchen buildings were smoking breakfast fires. The guard posts were manned, everything in its ordinary morning position. She was out there in the forest. She had been planning to leave before the convergence. She had known the guard rotations. She had packed carefully. She had not left because she was devastated. She had left because she had decided to leave, and the convergence had simply become the occasion. That was not the profile of a woman who was going to maintain a fated bond from her side for 11 months. That was not the profile of a woman who was sitting somewhere in the forest thinking about him. Something moved in him again, the thing he had not named last night and did not intend to name today. "Send 2 trackers," he said, "not a unit, 2, the best. Tell them it is a welfare matter, not a retrieval." Understood. Any parameters on how far they follow? He thought about this. He thought about a path through a dark forest and the specific kind of person who planned a night departure and executed it cleanly and left a room without leaving a trace. Follow the trail until they can establish she is safe and has shelter and resources. Then stop. Do not approach. Do not announce. And if she is not safe? He was quiet for a moment, then they assist. As instructed, Owen turned to go. And Owen, Selim kept his back to the room, still looking at the frostwhite lands below. The welfare check is not to be discussed, not with elders, not with other alphas, not with the convergence guests who are still on compound. It is an internal administrative matter. Of course, sir. Owen left. Selim stood at the window for a longer time than was practical. The morning was moving on outside, the light shifting, the kitchen smoke rising, the ordinary operations of the pack running themselves the way they did when a functional system was doing what it was built to do. He pressed his palm against his collarbone. Warm. Steady. The court healer had used the words active return signal. He had refused a fated bond before 1,000 witnesses, and the bond had looked at the refusal and decided to continue anyway. Not because he wanted it to, not because she wanted it to, because the bond had its own logic, its own patience, its own indifference to the decisions of kings. He did not know what she was like. He did not know what she thought or what she wanted, or why she had been in a convergence hall carrying cider cups when she had clearly been planning to leave anyway. He did not know what her voice sounded like, or what she did when she was not pouring cider, or what she had left behind in that clean, empty room. He knew she had a knife in her pack. The tracker report would confirm it or not. He already felt he knew. He knew she had planned. He knew she had not cried in that hall. He had watched her. He had not been watching for that, but he had watched anyway because a king watched, and she had not cried and she had not begged, and she had done the one thing he had not anticipated. She had looked at the hall. She had looked at all of them. And then she had walked out, and the door had closed behind her, and he had turned back to the elders and continued the ceremony because that was what you did. He had continued the ceremony. He moved away from the window and returned to his desk and opened the folio to item 15 and began to read about the border dispute in the Eastern Territories. He read 3 sentences. He went back to item 14. He read it a 3rd time. The words were the same: room clear, departure voluntary. He closed the folio. He stood up and went to the fire and put a piece of wood on it, and stood there with his hands held toward the growing warmth and thought about what the court healer had said. Active return signal. He thought about what that meant structurally, practically, in the language of bond mechanics he had studied, because he had believed knowing things prevented being blindsided by them. It meant her bond point was open, not because she was choosing to keep the connection, not consciously. The fated bond did not operate on conscious choice, which was the whole of the problem with it. It operated on a frequency beneath decision, beneath reasoning, beneath all the careful architecture a person built to keep themselves safe. Her bond point was open. She was out there in the forest, moving north, packing efficiently, planning her life with the precision of someone who had been planning for a long time. And on her collarbone, without her permission, something was still warm. He wondered if she had noticed. He thought she probably had. He thought, given what he was beginning to understand about her, that she had noticed and done the same thing he had done, catalogued it as a fact, acknowledged its inconvenience, and kept moving. He stood at the fire for another moment. Then he went back to the desk. He opened the folio to item 1, which was the most urgent item, which concerned a potential breach of treaty with the Western human government. He read it thoroughly. He made notes. He worked. The bond point in his chest stayed warm all morning, through 3 meetings and 2 correspondence responses, and a discussion with the elder council representative about the inheritance amendment, and it was warm at noon when he ate a brief lunch at his desk, and it was warm at dusk when the tracker returned and gave him a single piece of information before he could stop himself from wanting it. She had made the first ridge before dawn. She was moving north. Her tracks were clean, economical, well-placed. She knew what she was doing. She had been in forests before. He sent the tracker away. He sat in the early dark of his study with the lamps lit and the folio closed, and he looked at the far wall where the pack map hung, all 7 territories in their different colors, the borders between them and the unaffiliated lands beyond, the long routes north that any person leaving pack territory would take. He looked at the northern routes for a long time. Then he turned his chair away from the map. He opened the folio. He went back to work. Outside in the dark and cold, past the boundary stones and the tree line and the first ridge and into territory that belonged to no one and answered to no king, a girl walked north by starlight and carried with her, without knowing she carried it, the thing that was going to make every calculation he and she had both made come completely and absolutely apart. She knew on the 4th day. Not suspected, not worried. She had not been a person who worried forward into possibilities. That was a habit she had stripped out of herself young because worrying about possibilities cost the same energy as dealing with actualities, and actualities were what the world was made of. On the 4th day she knew. The morning sickness was not the worst of it. She had been mildly ill before, from bad water, from cold, from the particular exhaustion of pushing a body hard over difficult terrain, and her body's language for all of it was the same. She might have explained it away. She had a talent for practical explanations. What she could not explain away was the bond point. On the 4th morning she woke in the warden's shelter near the creek, a different one from the one she had shown a stranger 3 weeks ago, further north, on the route her map had described, and she lay in the gray pre-dawn light and felt the bond point on her collarbone, and it was not cold. It was warm. Quietly, steadily, persistently warm. She had assumed it would continue cooling. She had assumed by now it would be a faint scar feeling, the residual warmth of something that had been briefly there and then been refused and then been walked away from. That was how it was supposed to work. She had asked the pack healer once 2 years ago, phrasing the question hypothetically about refused bonds, and the healer had said the warmth faded within days. Within days. It was day 4. It was warm. She pressed her fingers against it. The warmth pressed back, steady and quiet and completely indifferent to the fact that it was not supposed to be there. She lay in the shelter cot and looked at the ceiling and did the arithmetic. She did it methodically. Date of the ridge path evening, 3 weeks to the convergence, 4 days since. She went through the math twice. She went through it a 3rd time with different assumptions to see if the result changed. The result did not change. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach. She lay like that for a long time. Outside the shelter the creek ran. A bird moved in the branches above the roof. The morning was coming in slowly through the gaps in the shuttered window, pale and gray, and proceeding at its usual pace regardless. She made herself sit up. She made herself eat a small portion of food, careful, because she now understood the nausea for what it was, and she needed to keep her strength, and nausea did not care about that, but she had never been very interested in what nausea cared about. She ate and drank water and sat on the edge of the cot and looked at the floor. She had one rule. She knew that rule. She had kept it for 22 years. She was not going to break it now. She breathed until her hands were steady. Then she thought. Not about him. She was not going to think about him yet. She was going to think about this practically, clearly, in the language of what was real and what was needed, and what she was capable of. What was real, she was pregnant. She was 4 days into a solo forest crossing in late autumn. She was heading north to a settlement that she had only heard about second-hand from 2 different sources, which meant it probably existed, but she had no guarantee of what she would find when she got there. What was needed to reach the settlement faster, to find shelter before deep winter hit, to locate a midwife or healer, to establish herself with a skill or trade before she was in the later months when physical work became limited. What she was capable of, she had 2.5 days of food remaining. Her water situation was good near the creek. She was physically strong, not malnourished, not injured, and her pace had been good. She could cover the distance to the settlement in one more hard day if she pushed. She could push. She had pushed before. She put her food pack in the bag. She folded the blanket she had used and left it on the cot because the shelter was maintained by wardens who used it, and she had a principle about shared spaces. She did a last check of her items by touch. Knife, linen, fire kit, food, map, water. She tied the bag. She stood. She opened the shelter door and stepped out into the cold morning. The forest was bright today, unexpected winter sun coming through the bare upper branches, throwing pale gold across the frostwhite ground. She could see her breath. The creek beside the path was running low and clear over gray stones. A hawk sat in a dead tree on the opposite bank and looked at her with the flat attention of a creature that had evaluated her and decided she was not relevant. She looked at the hawk for a moment. She walked north. She walked all day. She did not think about him. She thought about the path and the weather and her pace and the contents of her bag and the settlement she was walking toward. She thought about which skills to offer first, the healing work or the organizational capacity. She thought about winter food stores, about whether the settlement was likely to be walled or open, about the social structures she might find there, whether it was egalitarian in organization or had its own hierarchy. She thought about the child. Not in the terms of what it would require, she would get to that. She was already getting to that in the background where practical calculations ran, but in the simple present tense fact of it. There was something growing, small as a seed right now, probably the size of the nail on her smallest finger, and utterly, serenely unconcerned with the circumstances of its existence. It was not worried about kings or bonds or forests, or the 3 days of walking that stood between its mother and a shelter with walls. It was just growing. The steadiness of that was something she had not expected to find. She kept walking. By late afternoon the trees changed, broader-leaved varieties coming in among the pines, signs of lower elevation, signs of proximity to the valley the settlement map had described. She crested a ridge and stopped. Below, in the long, low valley, smoke rose. Multiple sources, chimneys, the rectangular shapes of rooflines visible even from here, scattered along the valley floor the way old settlements scattered, not in a grid but in the organic arrangement of people building near water and then near each other, and then gradually filling in the spaces between. She counted the smoke sources. 12, maybe 14. A real settlement. She let herself look at it for one long moment. Then she started down the ridge. She reached the valley floor as the light was going. The smoke smelled like pine and cooked food and the particular warmth of habitation, the smell that announced that people had been here long enough to make things permanent. A dog barked somewhere to her left and then stopped. A child's voice called something she couldn't hear clearly. A door opened and let out a rectangle of lamplight and then closed again. She found the central path, packed earth, wide enough for a cart, and followed it toward the cluster of buildings at the valley's center, and a woman came out of the nearest building before Lyra reached it. She was older, compact. She had the look of someone who had been running things for a long time, not loudly but thoroughly. She was wiping her hands on an apron, and she looked at Lyra with eyes that measured things efficiently. "You came from the North Pass," she said, not a question. "Southeast Ridge," Lyra said. The woman's eyes moved over her, the bag, the state of her boots, whatever she was reading from Lyra's face. "Alone," the woman said. "Yes. How long in the forest?" 4 days. Something in the woman's expression shifted, not to pity. Lyra registered the absence of pity with relief, but to a kind of considered reassessment. "Can you work?" "Yes," Lyra said. "Healing knowledge, basic herbalism, organizational work, whatever you need." The woman was quiet for a moment. "My name is Edna Hart," she said. "This is Hart's Crossing. We take in people who have reasonable skills and a willingness to contribute." A pause. "We don't ask where people come from, we ask what they intend to do here." Lyra looked at her steadily. "I intend to stay," she said. "I intend to work, and I should tell you now rather than later I am pregnant, early months. It won't affect my capacity for several more months at minimum, and I will be honest with you as it does." Edna Hart looked at her for a long moment. "Good," the woman said. "Honesty is the first requirement here. The second is pulling your weight." She stepped back and held the door open. "Come in, there's soup. We can talk about assignment in the morning when you've slept." Lyra stepped inside. The warmth was extraordinary. She had forgotten what it felt like to step into a room that was genuinely warm, the kind of warmth produced by good wood burning in a proper stove, not the small fire warmth of shelter camps or the drafty inadequate warmth of her stone room at the Pack compound. She stood in it for a moment. Her boots dripped on the stone floor. Edna put a bowl of soup in front of her and sat across the table and said nothing, which was a kindness of the specific kind that understood when people needed food before words. Lyra ate. The soup was plain root vegetables, broth, a little salt. It was the best thing she had eaten in 4 days. She finished it and Edna refilled the bowl without asking. She ate the second bowl more slowly. "The healer here," she said. "What is their background?" "His name is Peter. He's good with trauma and bone work, less experienced with pregnancy. He'll tell you that himself." Edna folded her hands on the table. "Why?" "Because I intend to be useful in that area if he wants the assistance," Lyra said. "I've worked with an experienced pack healer. I have knowledge he might not have and he'll have knowledge I don't. We could probably learn from each other." Edna looked at her with the expression of someone who was revising an assessment upward. "I'll introduce you tomorrow." "Thank you." "Thank me by staying," Edna said simply. "We need people who mean to stay." Lyra put her spoon down and looked at the older woman across the table. "I mean to stay," she said. And she did. She meant it with the whole of herself, the practical and the aching parts both. This place she had walked 4 days to reach. This valley with 14 chimneys and a woman named Edna who didn't ask where you came from. This settlement outside every hierarchy that had ever categorized her and found her lacking. She meant to stay. She meant to build. She meant to make something here that no king could refuse, that no system could rank, that would exist and persist regardless of what a hall full of wolves decided about her worth. The bond point in her collarbone was warm. She kept her hand in her lap. Miles away behind her, a king sat in a study and looked at a map with northern routes marked on it and pressed his palm against a warmth that would not cool. Neither of them knew yet how small the world actually was. Neither of them knew yet that the mathematics were still running. They were just a girl eating soup in a warm room for the first time in 4 days, and a king behind a closed folio pretending to work, and between them a bond that had decided not to obey, and growing in the quiet dark of the girl's body a small seed-sized certainty that was going to change everything. The soup was good. She finished it. She slept. The 72 hours passed. Then a week. Then 3 weeks. The trackers had followed Lyra's trail to the ridge, down into the valley, to the edge of the settlement they had found after another half-day's cautious tracking. They had not entered. They had confirmed. Settlement, multiple structures inhabited, fires burning, sign of organized habitation. They had confirmed she had entered it by the compressed boot print in the frost at the settlement path's edge. They had returned and reported. Selim had read the report with his morning tea, which for the first time in 3 weeks he actually drank while it was warm. He had filed it in the administrative folio in the domestic section, behind item 14, which he had by now read 9 times. He had told Owen the matter was resolved to his satisfaction and to close the welfare file. Owen had said, "Of course, sir," in the tone that meant he had thoughts he was not sharing. Selim had not asked for the thoughts. He had gone back to work. December came with its hard frosts and the short gray days that the north of the Pack lands always produced, and Selim managed the Inheritance Amendment and the Western Border Treaty and the Summit on River Rights that had been delayed twice and was now frankly overdue, and he chaired the Elder Council's winter session, and he handled the Challenger Pack Remnant's formal petition for reabsorption into the Pack system, which took 3 weeks of careful negotiation. He did all of this thoroughly and correctly. He did it with a warm place in his collarbone that was still there. He had stopped pressing his hand against it, He had started simply knowing it was there, the way you knew about a healed fracture, present in the background when conditions shifted, quiet otherwise. He had asked the court healer to monitor it without drawing attention from other staff. She reported monthly, bond point active, return signal consistent, no degradation. Consistent. The bond was not fading. It was not warming or cooling in response to his daily state. It simply sat steady at the particular warmth of something that had found its position and intended to maintain it. He had begun to understand what that meant. He had not admitted out loud to understanding it, but he understood it. Owen appeared in his study doorway one December morning without knocking, which was unusual. Owen had a knock discipline. It was one of the first things Salem had noticed about him when he had selected Owen as beta, the quality of his entrance, the way he always announced himself by waiting 2 seconds rather than bursting through. He valued it. It was one of the small rituals that made the machinery of authority run. Owen was not knocking. Salem looked up from the treaty document he was reviewing. Owen's face was doing the thing it did when something had happened that had weight, not still, exactly, but gathered, the way a person gathered themselves before carrying something heavy. "Sir," Owen said. "What?" "There is a communication from Hart's Crossing." A pause, very short. "That is the settlement in the Northern Valley." "Yes, sir." Salem set down his pen. "How do we have a communication from Hart's Crossing?" "Through channels." Owen's voice was measured. "The settlement operates a trade network with 3 of the Outer Pack communities. Information moves through it. This particular piece of information was passed through the outer community at Ridgeback, which has a relationship with our eastern border post, which has standing instructions to flag anything relevant to." He stopped, reorganized. "The border post flagged it and it came to me." "What is the information?" Owen looked at him. "She is pregnant," Owen said. The study was very quiet. The fire snapped. Outside, the winter wind moved against the windows with a flat, pressing sound. Salem sat very still. He thought in that moment of a great many things with the efficiency of a mind trained to process multiple facts simultaneously. He thought of bond mechanics and the court healer's reports. He thought of timing, the date of the convergence, the date of departure, the date now. He thought of the historical archive and the 40-year-old case and its particular details. He thought of the return signal, consistent and unchanged, and what that signal actually meant now, what it had perhaps always meant, the reason it had not faded. He thought of a woman who had walked away from a hall without crying and known the guard rotations, and left a room perfectly clean. He sat very still for a moment more. Then he moved. He stood, he went to the window. He stood there with his hands behind his back, and looked at the winter-packed lands and the frost on the hills, and the white sky that promised more snow by evening. "How advanced," he said. The communication did not include specific detail. The source was not a medical source. It was passed through trade conversation, general knowledge within the settlement. So multiple people knew. It was not a secret. She had not attempted to keep it as one, apparently. Why would she? She was outside Pack lands. She owed no report to a king who had refused her. He pressed this thought down. He pressed all of them down, the ones that were arriving fast and sharp, and that he needed to process systematically rather than in a rush. "Find me everything we have on Hart's Crossing," he said. "Population, leadership, economic base, security structure, everything. I'll have it within the hour." "And Owen, sir." He turned from the window. His face was what it was always when he had made a decision and was now implementing it, not cold, not warm, precise. "I will be traveling north, quietly, 2 people, not an escort, not a delegation." Owen's eyes were very still. "I will need 3 days, Salem said. "Tell the Elder Council I am taking a private survey of the Northern Territories. It is not unusual. I do private surveys. I have done them before." "You have," Owen agreed. "Never in December. There is a first time for everything." He moved back to the desk and began closing the treaty document and organizing the surface with the particular efficiency of someone who was going to be leaving it. "I need you here managing the council. Can you manage it?" "I can manage it." "Good." He stacked the documents. "Brief me on the Hart's Crossing report the moment it's ready, and Owen." He looked at his beta directly. This is a private matter, not a political matter, not a dynastic matter, private. Owen looked at him for a long moment with those precise, pale eyes that had seen 8 years of Selim Voss making decisions, and had formed opinions about all of them. "Understood," he said. He left. Selim stood at his desk. He pressed his hand against his collarbone. "Warm. The air." He said the word to himself, in the privacy of his own skull, and felt it land. He had refused a fated bond. He had done it publicly, legally, in full view of the pack world. He had done it efficiently and without sentiment, because efficiency and lack of sentiment were the tools he applied to everything he was not equipped to handle, which was not many things but was, it turned out, this. He had made a mistake. Not in the refusing, which had been the product of genuine calculation, of real priorities that were still real, of the honest assessment that a king's life did not leave room for fated bonds with unranked women in the middle of a diplomatic crisis. He had made a mistake in the manner of it. He had made a decision in 2 seconds, in public without information, about a person he did not know. He had let efficiency substitute for thought. He had seen the bond point glowing and the category of unranked domestic, and made a calculation, and he had been wrong in the way careful people were wrong when they applied the right tools to the wrong problem. He stood there and acknowledged this to himself entirely. He did not apologize to the room. He did not perform it for anyone. He acknowledged it, catalogued it, filed it, and moved. He began to plan. He pulled a map from the wall rack and unrolled it on his desk, the northern territories, the routes, the valley he had seen described in the tracker's report. He noted distances. He noted weather windows. He noted the 2-person travel profile he had used on previous private surveys, the cover story, the way the schedule would look from outside. He studied the map. He thought about what he was riding toward. He thought about what she was likely to say. He thought about this honestly, not with optimism. She had planned a night departure. She had crossed the ridge in the dark. She had established herself in a settlement in under a week. She was, by the information available to him, exactly as self-sufficient as the profile suggested, which meant she had not spent the last 2 months waiting for anyone to come after her. She had not been waiting. She had been building. He had sent the trackers to confirm her safety and then stopped them. He had filed her under resolved and gone back to his correspondence. He had spent 2 months making the efficient decision, which was to leave the situation where it was and manage it from a distance. And the situation had, in the way that situations always did when they were not addressed but merely managed from a distance, become something significantly larger. He rolled the map and put it in his travel case. He began packing. He was not a man who traveled with much. That was another quality he had established early, after watching 2 kings before him travel with 40-person retinues and spend more energy managing their entourage than the purpose of their travel. He took what he needed. He moved cleanly. He packed the case and set it by the door. He stood for a moment in the center of his study, the room where he had spent 8 years making decisions that had held the 7 packs together, and resolved 3 challenges, and negotiated the treaties, and rebuilt the inheritance system from the ground up. He was good at this room. He was good at the work this room required. He was less certain about what came next. He picked up the travel case. He walked out of the room and did not look back at the map on the wall, the 7-pack territory in its color-coded sections, the power structure he had spent 8 years building with careful hands and clear eyes, and the particular discipline of a man who did not allow himself to make personal mistakes, because personal mistakes were expensive when you were a king. This one had been expensive. He was going to go address the cost. The morning was gray and cold, and the snow the sky had been promising arrived while he was in the courtyard with his 2-person travel team, light flakes at first and then steadier, covering the packed lands in the patient, indifferent white of winter. He mounted. He rode north. She heard the knock on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd month of her time at Hart's Crossing, during the hour she spent at the settlement's clinic doing the work she had arranged with Peter, the settlement healer, who had been skeptical of her for approximately 3 days and then become a genuine colleague. The clinic was a single-room building adjacent to Edna Hart's main house. It had a good stove and clean shelves and a cot for patients and a work table where Lyra had spent 3 mornings a week since her second week at the settlement. She knew the room thoroughly, knew which shelf held what, knew the stove's particular behavior in cold weather, knew which floorboard creaked near the door. The knock came from that door. She was grinding dried bark and she did not stop immediately. She finished the pass and set the grinding stone down and wiped her hands on the cloth she kept tucked at her hip and turned. Edna Hart stood in the doorway. Edna did not usually come to the clinic during morning work hours. She had her own considerable management of the settlement to run. Her presence here at this hour, with her hands still rather than doing something, told Lyra immediately that the visit was not ordinary. "There are 2 men at the settlement gate," Edna said. Her voice was entirely even. "They came from the South Pass. One of them asked for you by name." Lyra went still. The grinding cloth was still in her hands. She did not think about who it was. She did not let herself do that yet. "What did they look like?" she said. "One of them is a large man, quiet. He stayed back near the horses." Edna paused. "The other one is," another pause, the kind Edna did not usually make. "He is not a trader, Lyra. He is not a warden or a border official or anyone I have seen the like of in 20 years of running this settlement." Lyra put the cloth down on the table. She looked at the small window above the work table. The morning light was flat and gray. Snow was falling outside. She could not see the gate from here. "Did he say his name?" she said. "He said to tell you Cale had come down from the ridge in better light this time." The room was quiet. The stove ticked. Lyra stood at the work table with her back to the door and her hands flat on the surface, and she felt the bond point on her collarbone, steady, warm, the same warmth it had been for months, the same warmth she had organized her life around ignoring. It was not steady right now. It was something else. She breathed. She thought about the settlement around her, the 12 chimneys, the people who had come here for the same reasons she had, the work she had built in 3 months, the arrangement with Peter, Edna's table and Edna's directness, and the way people here said your name like they meant to know you for a long time. She thought about the clarity of her days here, the particular rightness of being somewhere she had chosen, doing work she had chosen, answering to no hierarchy except the one that said you pulled your weight and you told the truth. She thought about walking into that hall with her tray of cider cups. She thought about the path through the dark forest, her boots wet from the stream crossing, dawn coming over the eastern mountains. She thought about a man propped against a fir tree at dusk, with a dislocated shoulder, who had told her thank you like he was careful with the words. She picked up the grinding cloth. She folded it. She put it on the shelf. She turned around. "Tell him," she said, "that I will be there in 10 minutes, and Edna," she looked at the older woman steadily, "whatever he tells you about who he is, it's probably true." Edna's expression did not change. "I suspected as much." "I'm sorry," Lyra said, "for bringing whatever this is to your gate." Edna looked at her for a long moment. "Don't apologize for arriving with complexity," she said. "Everyone who comes here arrives with complexity. That is generally why people come." She left. Lyra stood alone in the clinic for a moment. She pressed one hand against her stomach. The child was not visible yet. She was barely showing, her frame and the loose clothing and the careful positioning she had adopted all conspiring to keep it private for a little while longer. Not forever. She had never intended forever. Just long enough to be established here, to have roots deep enough that she did not feel like something that could be easily moved. Her roots were deep enough. She put her coat on. She walked outside. The snow was coming steadily now, small fine flakes that caught in her hair and settled on the shoulders of her coat. She walked the path between the clinic and the main settlement path, past Edna's house, past the workshop where she could hear the morning work happening, past the corner where the children often gathered before their lessons. She reached the gate. They were on the other side of it. The other man, the one Edna had described as staying back, was near the horses, which were good horses, she noticed automatically, the kind of well-maintained travel horses that belonged to someone who understood what it cost to be badly equipped on a long journey. He was watching her with the look of a man doing his job, which was a protective job, and he was doing it from a careful distance. The man at the gate was Cale. He was taller than she remembered, or the forest at dusk had compressed him somehow. He stood with his hands at his sides in the snow, his coat dark and practical, no decoration, nothing that announced anything, no retinue, no crown, no theatrics. He looked exactly like a man who had ridden through winter weather to reach a specific place, and had now arrived. His eyes found hers the moment she came around the corner. She stopped 4 feet from the gate. She looked at him. She was not going to be the first one to speak. That was a decision she had made in the 10 minutes between Edna's visit and this moment. A small decision, not a strategic one, just the decision of a person who had been doing the work of honesty for 3 months, and had learned that the honest thing was often to let silences say what words tried to manage. He looked at her. He said, "I took the left path this time." She registered this, the split pine. She had told him. She had told him which way the path went, and he had remembered, and he had said it now not as an icebreaker or a performance but as information, the way he seemed to communicate straightforwardly. "You're 2 months late," she said. "I am 3 months late," he said. "I was wrong about when to come." She looked at him. She looked at him the way she had looked at the empty room on the last night, the clear, particular seeing of someone who had already made a decision, and was now simply executing it. "You'd better come in," she said. She unlatched the gate. She opened it. She stepped back. He walked through. The gate swung shut behind him with a quiet, certain sound. She looked at him standing inside the settlement she had built herself into, in the snow, with his careful hands and his iron-weather eyes, and the thing at his collarbone she could feel now like a pulse, like a second heartbeat, like a door opening on both sides at once. She said, "You're too late for everything except the part you came for." He was quiet for a moment. The snow fell. "What part is that?" he said. "The part where we talk," she said, "and you listen, and then we decide what happens next." He nodded once clean. "All right," he said. She turned and walked toward the clinic. He followed. The snow covered their tracks behind them. The clinic stove had been running all morning, and the room was warm by the time she closed the door and faced him. He took up more of the room than seemed architectural. She noticed this with the same part of her brain that noticed everything, the automatic cataloging that had kept her safe in crowded environments, a person who filled space without taking it, the kind of physical presence that announced itself not through movement but through weight. She did not offer him a chair. She stood at the work table and kept the table between them because she was not angry exactly, and she was not afraid exactly, and she was something that had no single name, something that lived between those two things and needed the table to be between them while she figured out what it was. He looked around the room briefly, at the shelves, at the work surface, at the organized rows of her supplies and the grinding stone and the labeled jars and the particular arrangement of a space that had been made functional and clean by someone who cared about the work that happened in it. "You've been here 3 months, he said. 11 weeks, she said. Edna Hart gave me a room and a work assignment in the clinic on my first night. I've been doing 4 days a week here and 2 days in the settlement kitchen since the 2nd week. You established yourself quickly. I had skills and I told the truth." She looked at him. That was sufficient. He absorbed this. "Lyra," he said. "Don't," the word came out quietly. "Don't start there, start somewhere that matters." He was still for a moment. The stove ticked. The snow came against the window. "I was wrong," he said. She waited. "At the convergence," he said, "I made a decision in 2 seconds in public without information about a person I did not know. I applied the right process to the wrong situation. I had priorities that were real, and the process was one I had used correctly before, but I applied it to something that required something different from me, and I did not understand that until it was done." She looked at him. "That is a very organized way to describe what you did," she said. "Yes," he said, "I know. 1,000 people were watching." "Yes, I was carrying cider cups." Yes, something moved across his face, not quite pain, the expression of someone sitting with a thing they had caused and were not going to excuse or move away from. "I know what it looked like, I know what it was." She pressed her hands flat on the work table. "Why did you come?" she said. "And I want the real answer, not the dynastic one, not the bond mechanics one, not the succession law one. The real one." He looked at her for a long moment. "Because the bond did not cool," he said. "And I have been trained to understand that means something, and I spent 2 months trying to decide if what it meant was something I could manage from a distance, and then I received information that made clear the answer was no." A pause. "And because I have spent 2 months in rooms full of people doing important work, and the room has been quieter than it should be, in a way I do not have a better word for." She looked at him. She thought about what he had not said, and whether the not saying was cowardice or honesty, and decided it was probably the particular honesty of someone who did not embellish. "There is a child," she said. "I know. It is mine," she said, "mine. Not yours in any way that I intend to negotiate or compromise on. I am building a life here, and the child is part of that life, and that life belongs to me." "I understand," he said. "I am not sure you do," she said. "So let me be clear. I am not going back to Pac Lands. I am not going to the Iron Seat. I am not going to be installed somewhere and managed. I am not going to trade one kind of categorization for another. I am here and I intend to stay here, and the fact that you have ridden through December to arrive at my gate does not change any of those things." He looked at her. "What does it change?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "That," she said, "is what we are going to figure out." She pulled out the chair on her side of the table and sat down. She looked at him steadily. He sat down across from her. The stove burned. The snow came against the window. Between them, across a work table that smelled like dried bark and clean linen, two people who had each been running their own version of a story about who they were and what they owed each other began, without ceremony, to talk. She said what she needed. He listened. Not the way authority listened, managing, evaluating, preparing the response. He listened the way someone listened who understood they had spent months not listening and were aware of the cost of that and were trying to do the different thing now. She watched him listen. She watched his face when she said the things that were hard to say, the leaving, the forest, the 4 days, the morning on day 4 when she had pressed her hand against her stomach and done the arithmetic. She watched his face stay steady and not flinch and not perform understanding but simply hold what she was saying. She said all of it. She held nothing back. When she was done, the room was quiet except for the stove and the snow and the distant sound of the settlement going about its Tuesday. He said, "What do you need from me?" She looked at him. "Recognition," she said, "not titles, not claims, not anything that goes through Pac law or elder councils or the political machinery that will want to make this into something manageable and organized." She held his eyes. "I need you to know what you did and to say it clearly. And I need you to understand that the child will know who they are, which is mine, which is also yours, which is a person who did not choose this situation and deserves not to be used as a piece in any game." He was quiet. "And you," he said, "what do you need for yourself?" She looked at him. This was the question she had not prepared for. This was the one that came from somewhere she had not expected. Not the king, not the man managing a mistake, but something else, something quieter, the question of someone who was actually asking. She pressed her hand against her collarbone for a moment, not against the bond point, just against her chest. "I need to stay," she said. "Here, I need this to be mine. Whatever else happens, whatever you decide, whatever the bond decides, whatever the Pac law says about heirs and successions and all the things that are going to become complicated, I need this place to be mine and not negotiable." He looked at her for a long time. "It is yours," he said. "You cannot give it to me," she said. "It already is." He absorbed this. "Then I am confirming what you already have," he said. "Yes," she said, "that is what you are doing." He looked at her steadily with those iron rain eyes that she had looked at in a dark forest, and then in a blazing hall, and now here, across a work table in a clinic in a settlement that belonged to nobody's Pac and nobody's king, in the snow. "All right," he said. She looked at him. She thought about everything she knew and everything she did not know, and the very large space between them and the very steady warmth in her collarbone, and the child that was growing with the serene, complete indifference of things that had decided to exist. She thought about the table between them. She thought about the fact that he had taken the left path. "You can stay for today," she said. "I will introduce you to Edna and to Peter, and you will be a person who came to see someone they know, which is true, and then tomorrow I will decide if I want you to come back." He looked at her. "And if you decide you don't, then you will know where to find me," she said, "and you will not come." A long moment. "And if you decide that you do." She looked at him. She pressed her hand flat against her collarbone and felt the warmth of it and the weight of 11 weeks and one bad night in a blazing hall and one evening on a ridge in the dark and all the distance between those things. And she thought about what she wanted and whether she was willing to risk wanting it and whether the risk was hers to take. She thought about the child. She thought about the fire in this room. She thought about the left path and what it meant to come down from the ridge without falling. "If I decide that I do," she said slowly, "you will come back on Saturday early, and you will be useful." He looked at her. Something in his face changed. Not softened, that was not the word for what his face did. It settled. The way a door settled into a frame it had been made for. "Saturday," he said. "Early," she said. "I understand." She stood up. She walked to the clinic door and opened it. The cold air and the snow came in, bright and sharp and indifferent to the whole of it. She stood with the door open and she looked at him, this man who had come through December to sit across a work table from her and listen, and she thought, this is not forgiveness. This is not resolution. This is the beginning of something that is going to require more from both of them than either of them has currently shown capacity for. But it is a beginning. "Come on," she said. "I'll introduce you to Edna. She's going to have questions." He stood. He straightened his coat. He walked toward the door. He walked out of it into the snow. She followed him. She did not reach out. She did not close the distance between them or cross any of the lines she had drawn. She walked beside him at a careful, deliberate distance across the snowy settlement path, toward Edna Hart's door, with the bond point in her collarbone warm and present and entirely her own. And in her body, quietly, the child grew. Small and complete and certain as anything she had ever been certain of, growing in the dark without asking permission, growing toward a world that had not yet decided what to make of it, growing with the particular stubbornness of things that had come from difficulty and intended, regardless, to exist. By the time they reached Edna's door and she knocked, and Edna's measured voice said, "Come in," Lyra had decided. She had decided without ceremony and without softness, and without anything she would not be prepared to defend in clear daylight. Saturday. She was going to let him come back on Saturday. That was all it was, one door slightly open, on terms that were entirely, completely, non-negotiably hers. She opened Edna's door. She walked inside. The warmth of the room closed around her, and she stood in it and breathed and felt the weight of the day in her body, the good kind of weight, the kind that came from having held your ground and not yielded anything that was not yours to yield. Edna looked at them from across her kitchen table. She looked at Selim. She looked at Lyra. She said, "Sit down, I'll put the kettle on." Lyra sat. Selim sat. The kettle went on. And outside the snow fell on Hart's Crossing in the quiet, even way that snow fell on places that were not asking for anything, that simply were what they were, solid and particular and real, and the valley held them all in its long gray arms, and the chimneys smoked, and the settlement went on being a settlement, belonging to no king and no pack and no system that had ever decided who was worth what. It belonged to the people who had chosen it. It was theirs. She was theirs. And somewhere in the slow, patient future that was already becoming the present, a child was going to be born into a valley that did not categorize by rank, and that child was going to be told the truth about who they were, and the truth was this. You came from two people who both knew what it was to be wrong, and who both knew what it was to keep walking anyway, and you are the proof that walking kept going even after everything that should have stopped it. That was the whole of the story. That was the beginning and the middle and the end of it. The kettle began to sing.